I'll start with a brief observation of how painful it is to see the church so empty on this occasion when I'm so accustomed to seeing it absolutely packed on a Good Friday. Those who are anxious to renew their commitment to Christ by being here to listen to the narrative of his sacrifice upon the cross and to have had the experience now, not just today, but yesterday, of asking people to, that they simply cannot stay. They must be turned away, and sympathizing with the pain of that. For I think it is touching that there are those who do not run away from Christ, but those who will be near him through these days of trial. And remember, I also offer the note that, again, in our diminished liturgies, there will be no approach to the cross for adoration today, but that you shall adore and venerate from your pews, and that veneration will be much briefer than we're accustomed to. To my reflection on today, when I sat down to think about this, I recalled a particular lecture that I had heard at the School of Journalism in Ottawa that I attended. It was about death, of all things. How it wasn't news. We all die. A measure of its newsworthiness is that most deaths, if they make the newspaper, they are reported in the obituary section, a place my professor noted where people pay to have that news printed. Quite opposite to how other news appears there, where it is solicited by the newspaper. Television and radio do even have that. And on the internet now, of course, funeral homes do have a section for those notices, but again, it's not presented as news, anything that ought to have our attention. But then, the lecturer said, it's obvious that some deaths make the news and actually are big news. Now, some of that has to do with celebrity, someone well known, a public figure, a politician, a movie actor, a pop star. These get our attention, well, because of our sentimental attachment to people we think we know, who are familiar to us because we've seen their picture 1,000 times, we've watched their films, we've heard their songs. If a politician, well, we've either voted for them or against them. And so we respond as if we do really know them. Perhaps know them the way we might know a cousin we don't see too often. Nonetheless, we'll talk amongst ourselves at the office, around the water cooler, as it were, about this public figure's death as we would at a funeral home visitation for someone we actually do know, trading stories, information about them, as if we were somehow really connected. It's a quirk of our psychology, but one that may be overcome by many eventually. I recall more than 20 years ago, all those who openly wept, for example, when the Princess of Wales died in a car accident in Paris. I can't say that affected me in any way like that, but, I was respectful about the whole thing. I didn't mock Diana's death or those who grieved it. Now, my professor then said, now we've got to set aside that whole very particular category of the famous and then consider the great mass of humanity. Someone dies. Is it news? Well, you had to figure something out, he said, revealing something that is perhaps not very nice about us as human beings. But he said you have to ask the question, and it sounds dismissive of the countless lives that pass every day and probably raises to awareness something unseeming about you and I, but you have to ask, so they're dead, who cares? And you have to ask that question in earnest, he said, not dismissively. Who cares? Or why should anyone care? How does this death concern you and I? And to be frank, that's an inquiry into self-interest, self-concern, and fear. You might not read a few paragraphs about some poor soul knocked over by a bus on King Street until that death becomes connected to perhaps other transit accidents in the city, and then suddenly you realize, hey, I live here. Is it safe to walk downtown? Am I in danger of being run over by a bus? And then you devour that story, and you think about it, and it worries you a little. Now, if that story took place in Montreal or New York, you wouldn't be apt to care, when am I going to be in Montreal or New York? That's why even the most tragic deaths in foreign lands don't make the news. That's why we know only in the abstract the horrors perpetrated by the Chinese Communist government against its internal enemies. why we're unaware of the terror of Boko Haram in Nigeria or the Taliban in faraway Afghanistan. We don't know the details of the corrupt court proceedings that condemn so many an innocent to prison, to death in foreign lands, because it's hard in the midst of our own busy lives, our own problems, to concern ourselves with people we don't know, in a faraway place subject to an evil and injustice that we don't perceive as a threat to us, at least not an immediate one. And for those who do take an interest in such things, who protest over, say, China's annexation of Tibet or its persecution of the Uyghurs, its crackdown in Hong Kong, it's frustrating to run into, I won't say the indifference of so many of us, but rather that we have only a vague awareness of what's going on and are distracted from these things by our own worries and concerns. Today we're told a story of a death. And I hope our attention to it doesn't come from Jesus being, well, a celebrity of history, one of those handful of names like Cleopatra or Abraham Lincoln that have come down to us through the ages, and so we know is in some way important, and we ought to take some of our attention and divert it to them. No, we should ask ourselves, why should we care? Why should I care? And I hope we have the wisdom to see that while this was something that happened 2,000 years ago and very far away, that while Pontius Pilate and the Roman Empire are not a threat to us, while the temple authorities of long ago Jerusalem cannot menace us, that what Jesus faced in these 3 days was something that imperils us to this very day. The forces of sin and death, these are real. And they come in the form of our everyday worries, distracting us from what ought to be our true concerns, our sins of omission that have us forget our persecuted brothers and sisters throughout the world, our sins of commission that divide us here within our nation, our immediate community, our families, what separates us from the love of God and keeps us from the eternal communion he offers us. Jesus defeats our enemies and destroys sin and death as that which truly threatens us. But it is not merely a spectacle for us to watch, a fact of history for us to consider when we've got the time. But this is a sacrifice we need to be a part of, a death we need to share in, so that his life can come into our lives, and we then live together forever.